Prepare to immerse yourself in a tale that defies reason and reveals the darkest side of human nature. There are secrets so deep they span entire generations, silences so dense that not even death can break them. Comment below where you're watching from as we explore together one of the most disturbing mysteries the Appalachian Mountains have ever held. It was the year 1835, when West Virginia was still part of Virginia, and isolated mountain communities lived by their own unwritten laws. The Appalachian region was a maze of deep valleys and mist-shrouded peaks, where entire families could go months without seeing a stranger. The roads were dirt trails that disappeared beneath the snow in winter, and the nearest justice was a day's ride away. In this landscape of absolute isolation, secrets could be buried as deep as the dead in the hills. In Greenbrier County, there was a property known simply as Holloway Farm. The family who lived there kept their distance from their nearest neighbors, who were nearly 2 miles away via steep trails. The Holloways were known locally as people of few words, rarely coming down to the village for business or religious services. But it was in the fall of that year that something began to draw attention. Sarah Holloway, the family matriarch, had simply disappeared. No one saw Sarah leave. No one witnessed any arguments or conflicts. She simply disappeared from view on the rare occasions anyone passed by the property. When questioned, her 3 adult daughters always offered the same answer in monotone voices and blank stares. Their mother had left to care for a sick relative in another county. They didn't know when she would return. They hadn't received any letters. The story sounded strange, but in that time and place, people learned not to ask too many questions about other people's affairs. Months turned into years. Sarah Holloway was never seen again. Her daughters, Elizabeth, Margaret, and Catherine, continued to live on the isolated farm, farming enough to survive and rarely seen in the village. When anyone asked about their mother, the answer was always the same. Delivered with a coldness that chilled the blood, she hadn't returned. The 3 sisters grew old together on that property, never married, never had other family nearby. They lived like shadows among the trees, elusive figures that generated whispers in the community. What made it all even stranger was the way the sisters behaved. Witnesses who occasionally saw them in the village described a peculiar pattern. They always walked together, never separated, and spoke as if they shared a single thought. There was something rehearsed in every gesture, every word. It was as if they had made an unbreakable pact, a promise sealed with something stronger than blood. And perhaps they had done just that. The 1840s brought changes to the region. New families arrived, roads were improved, and the presence of the law became a little more constant. But Holloway Farm remained a place apart, an island of silence where time seemed to have stopped in 1835. The sisters grew older, but the mystery surrounding Sarah's disappearance only grew, fueled by decades of absolute silence. Some claimed to have heard strange sounds coming from the property during the new moon. Others swore they saw the 3 sisters walking single file to a specific spot at the back of the farm, carrying lanterns that flickered like lost souls. But no one dared to investigate. The fear stemmed not just from the isolation of the place, but from something deeper, an instinctive sense that certain truths are too dangerous to uncover. By the year 1862, the Civil War was beginning to tear the country apart, and even the isolated Appalachian Mountains were feeling the tremors of conflict. Virginia had seceded from the Union, but the western counties, including Greenbrier, were divided in their loyalties. It was a time of chaos, where traditional law had all but ceased to exist, replaced by the law of survival. And it was during this turbulent period that Elizabeth Holloway, the eldest of the 3 sisters, died. She was then 57 years old. The cause of death was recorded simply as a prolonged fever by the only traveling physician who passed through the area every few months. There was no autopsy, no investigation. Elizabeth was buried at the back of the property, in an area the family called a garden, though nothing but weeds grew there. Margaret and Catherine presided over the burial alone, inviting no one, allowing no neighbors to pay their respects. The coffin was lowered into the earth, while the 2 remaining sisters stood side by side in absolute silence. But something changed after that death. Margaret, now the eldest, began displaying even more peculiar behavior. Neighbors who occasionally saw her reported that she talked to herself, or rather spoke as if someone were right next to her, answering questions no one else could hear. Catherine, for her part, became even more reclusive, practically disappearing from public view. The farm fell into such a profound silence that some speculated whether they had both passed away or died. During the final years of the war, between 1863 and 1865, the region suffered from food shortages and the occasional passage of soldiers from both sides. Properties were looted, barns burned, families displaced. But Holloway Farm remained untouched, as if protected by an invisible barrier. Soldiers passing nearby reported an inexplicable sense of unease, a sudden urge to move on without investigating. It was as if the place carried a silent curse. By the end of the war in 1865, West Virginia had become a separate state, created in 1863. New authorities were established, records began to be compiled, and for the first time in decades, an official turned his attention to Holloway Farm. A county representative was sent to take a census of the properties and their inhabitants. What he found deeply disturbed him. Margaret and Catherine still lived there, now 61 and 58 years old, respectively. The property was visibly neglected. The barn leaned dangerously, the main house had a partially collapsed roof, and what had once been cultivated fields was now nothing but tall weeds. But most disturbing was the state of the two sisters. They seemed to have aged far beyond their years, with completely white hair, paper-pale skin, and eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. When the representative asked about other family members, about Sarah Holloway, who was listed in the old records, the sisters repeated their usual story. Their mother had left decades ago to care for a relative. When he asked about Elizabeth, they said she was buried in the back garden. The man asked to see the grave and was led to an area at the back of the property where there were 3 clearly identifiable mounds of earth. 3 graves. Not 1, but 3. The representative felt a shiver run down his spine. He pointed to the 3 mounds and asked who else was buried there. Margaret and Catherine exchanged a quick glance, the kind of glance people develop after decades of total isolation, a silent communication more eloquent than words. Then Margaret answered in a flat voice. They were her parents. Her father had died long ago, even before 1835, and her mother had returned years later and died of old age. The explanation didn't match the records. The sister's father had indeed died before 1835, but it was documented that he was buried in the local churchyard, not on the property, and Sarah Holloway had supposedly left and never returned. Now suddenly there were 3 graves on a property where there should have been only 1. The representative took detailed notes, promised to return with further questions, but never did. Some say he fell seriously ill in the following weeks and chose to let the matter drop. The following years brought a slow but noticeable transformation to the Appalachian region. Railroads began to cut through the mountains, small towns grew around stations, and the isolation that once protected secrets began to unravel. But Holloway Farm remained a pocket of another time, a place where the past refused to be buried, even if 3 mounds of earth suggested otherwise. Margaret Holloway died in 1878 at the age of 74. Her death was recorded as due to heart complications, but no one other than Catherine was present in her final moments. The burial followed the pattern established decades earlier. No ceremony, no witnesses, just Catherine digging another hole in that cursed earth at the back of the property. Now there were 4 mounds, 4 secrets buried in soil that seemed never satisfied. Catherine then became the last of the Holloway sisters, a 75-year-old woman living alone in a decaying estate, surrounded only by ghosts and memories. Her closest neighbors, who had moved to the area years after Sarah's original disappearance, didn't know the full story. To them, Catherine was simply an eccentric elderly woman living in isolation. Occasionally someone would offer help, bring groceries, or try to strike up a conversation. Catherine accepted the charity with minimal gestures and even fewer words, but there were times when her facade of silence cracked. A young farmer named Thomas Brennan, whose property was relatively nearby, reported a disturbing encounter in 1880. He had gotten lost while hunting and ended up near Holloway Farm at dusk. He saw lamplight in the house and knocked on the door asking for directions. Catherine answered, and for the first time in decades invited someone inside. The house was in a deplorable state. Furniture covered in dust, the ceiling stained with damp, a musty smell, and something else Thomas couldn't quite identify. Catherine offered him water and sat across from him in the dark kitchen. Then, without him asking, she began to speak. Her words came in fragments, as if her mind were racing through decades in seconds. She mentioned Elizabeth and Margaret by name, referring to them in the present tense, as if they were still alive. He told her they would never leave him, that they had promised to remain together forever. Thomas felt extremely uncomfortable. He tried to change the subject, but Catherine continued, this time talking about his mother. She said Sarah had a terrible temper, that she demanded absolute obedience, that she had taught them from an early age that family is a bond stronger than any human law. Then Catherine stopped abruptly, looked directly at Thomas with eyes that seemed to see through time, and whispered something he would never forget. Sometimes, protecting a name means burying the truth so deep that not even God can unearth it. Thomas practically ran out of the house. He reported the encounter to a few neighbors, but no one paid much attention. Catherine was known for being strange, and elderly people who lived in isolation often developed peculiarities. But Thomas couldn't forget that look, those words, and especially the feeling he had as he passed the back of the property on his way out. He swore he saw the 4 mounds of earth glowing faintly in the moonlight, as if something beneath the surface refused to rest. The 1880s brought a particularly harsh winter to the region. Blizzards isolated properties, and many elderly people living alone did not survive the cold. Catherine Holloway was found dead in her home in February 1883. She was 80 years old. A neighbor who hadn't seen her in weeks decided to check and found her sitting in her favorite chair in the kitchen, dead for days. Her body was rigid, her eyes open, and in her hand she held an object that disconcerted everyone who saw it. A yellowed piece of paper, folded multiple times, covered with what appeared to be a list of names. The local sheriff was called. He examined the paper and found 4 names written in ancient handwriting: Sarah Holloway, Elizabeth Holloway, Margaret Holloway, and Catherine Holloway. Beneath the names, a single sentence in shaky letters: what we did together. What we know dies with us. There was no date, no signature beyond the names already listed, no further explanation. It was like a testament to silence, an oath that had stood for half a century. Sheriff Jonathan Caldwell was not a man to ignore strange details. He had served during the Civil War, seen things ordinary men shouldn't, and had developed a keen instinct for when something was deeply wrong. That piece of paper in Catherine Holloway's hand set off all his internal alarms. He decided that before burying the last of his sisters, he needed to understand what had really happened on that property over nearly 50 years. Caldwell began his investigation with county records. Greenbriar's archives were disorganized, and many documents had been lost or damaged during the war, but he was patient. He discovered that Sarah Holloway had officially disappeared in 1835, never having been declared dead. There were no travel records, no correspondence, nothing to prove she had gone to care for any relatives. In fact, genealogical records showed that Sarah had no living siblings at the time, and her parents had already died years earlier. Even more intriguing, Caldwell found a document from 1834, a year before the disappearance. It was a report filed by a neighbor at the time, complaining of screams coming from Holloway Farm for several consecutive nights. The sheriff at the time had noted that he visited the property, spoke with Sarah and her daughters, and concluded it was just a minor family argument. No action was taken. That sheriff had died decades ago, but his negligence had left a mystery unsolved. Caldwell then decided to do what should have been done 50 years earlier: examine the graves at the back of the property. He gathered 2 deputies and returned to Holloway Farm on a cold March afternoon in 1883. The property was even more dilapidated, with winter snow having collapsed part of the roof of the main house. They walked to the back, where there were now 5 mounds, including Catherine's, which had been added days earlier. The mounds were irregular, clearly dug by amateur hands, unmarked beyond roughly stacked stones. Caldwell ordered them to begin with the first grave, which supposedly contained Sarah Holloway's remains. The ground was frozen, making the work arduous. It took them hours to reach sufficient depth. What they found momentarily made them retreat. There were indeed human remains there, but not in a coffin. The body had simply been wrapped in thick, already decomposed cloth and placed directly in the ground. From the fragments of clothing and some personal objects found, including a brooch that old neighbors recognized as belonging to Sarah Holloway, it was possible to confirm the identity. But there was something more disturbing. The skull had a clear fracture on the back, a mark that medical experts later consulted identified as consistent with impact with a heavy object. Caldwell felt his stomach churn but continued. He ordered the second grave exhumed. This one supposedly contained the sister's father, but records showed he should be buried in the churchyard. When they opened the second mound, they again found human remains without a coffin, wrapped only in cloth. This time, however, it was impossible to determine identity from objects alone, as there were none. The bones were in an advanced state of decay, suggesting that the burial was indeed very old, possibly before 1835. The third grave revealed the remains of Elizabeth Holloway, who died in 1862. Unlike the others, it contained a simple wooden coffin, already quite deteriorated. The body was better preserved due to the coffin and the more recent burial. There were no obvious signs of trauma, and the death from fever reported decades ago seemed plausible. But why bury her on the property instead of in the cemetery? Why maintain this standard of isolation even in death? Margaret was in the fourth grave, also in a simple coffin. Her death in 1878 meant the body was relatively well preserved. Again, no obvious signs of trauma, but Caldwell was beginning to notice a more sinister pattern. All these women had been kept hidden from outside eyes, buried in secret, as if the family feared someone would discover something through public burials or post-mortem examinations. Catherine, the last, had not yet been officially buried when Caldwell began his investigation. He ordered a physician to examine the body before burial. The examination revealed death by natural causes, likely cardiac arrest exacerbated by the extreme cold. But more hidden documents were found on her person. Old, unsent letters addressed to authorities who never received them, all written at different times over the decades. The letters found with Catherine were like windows into a mind tormented by decades of enforced silence. The oldest was dated 1847, 12 years after Sarah's disappearance. In it, Catherine, then 44, wrote to a judge in the neighboring county, confessing that her mother had never left the property. The letter vaguely described a violent confrontation on an October night in 1835, but stopped abruptly mid-sentence, as if Catherine had lost the courage to continue. The second letter was dated 1853, addressed to a pastor who had served briefly in the area before leaving for another parish. Catherine wrote about the weight of carrying secrets that corrupt the soul, about how silence can be more destructive than any earthly punishment. She mentioned her sisters, saying that the three of them had made a pact when they were young, an oath that the Holloway family name would never be tarnished no matter the cost, but the letter never explained what secret protected that name. There was a third letter, this one from 1869, 7 years after Elizabeth's death. Catherine was writing to state officials, but the text was confusing, almost delirious. She spoke of voices she heard at night, of how Elizabeth would visit her in her dreams, demanding silence. She said Margaret was beginning to weaken, considering confessing everything before she died, but that she, Catherine, needed to ensure the pact was kept. The letter ended with a chilling line. "We promised her we would carry her name clear to the grave, and we will do so." Sheriff Caldwell spent weeks trying to piece together this macabre puzzle. He interviewed all the old-timers in the area, those old enough to remember the 1830s. One of them, an 82-year-old named Elijah Porter, finally offered crucial information. Porter remembered Sarah Holloway with disturbing clarity. According to Porter, Sarah was known locally as a hot-tempered and controlling woman. She ruled her 3 daughters with an iron fist, rarely allowing them to interact with neighbors or attend social events. There were rumors, never substantiated, that Sarah had killed her husband years earlier, but back then, people didn't question deaths on isolated properties much. What Porter remembered most vividly was a specific incident in the summer of 1835. He was hunting near Holloway Farm when he heard a violent argument. The voices were female, multiple, shouting simultaneously. Porter couldn't make out any words, but the tone was utterly confrontational. He considered checking to see if anyone needed help, but something in the tone of the voices made him back away. It was more than ordinary anger. It was a primal rage, the kind of sound that makes your blood freeze in your veins. He left quickly and never told anyone, until now. Caldwell began to form a theory. Sarah Holloway had been a domestic tyrant, controlling her adult daughters with psychological and likely physical violence. Sometime in 1835, the 3 daughters rebelled. The confrontation escalated beyond control. Sarah was killed, likely during a struggle, and the sisters faced a terrible choice: confess and face the gallows, as killing one's own mother was considered one of the most heinous crimes of the time, or bury the body and the secret together. They chose silence. But it wasn't a simple silence. It was a pact that required the 3 of them to remain together, isolated, living with Sarah's ghost and the weight of her death for decades. They never married because they couldn't trust anyone else with the secret. They never left the estate because they feared that separated, one of them might weaken and confess. They lived as prisoners of their own choosing, growing old together on a farm that had become a tomb for the living. But there were still missing pieces of the puzzle. Who was in the second grave, that very old unmarked burial? If it was indeed the sister's father, why wasn't he in the churchyard as recorded? Caldwell decided to dig deeper into the death records. He discovered that Mr. Holloway's funeral in 1831 had been a closed casket affair, justified at the time by a supposed illness that had disfigured the body. But no one other than the immediate family had seen the body. The possibility began to form in Caldwell's mind. What if Sarah had killed her husband years earlier? What if her daughters already lived in terror of knowing their mother was a murderer? This would explain the absolute control Sarah exerted over them. She controlled them not simply through ordinary tyranny, but through forced complicity in a previous crime. Her daughters knew what she was capable of, and they lived in constant fear of becoming her next victims. Sheriff Caldwell's investigation took on a dimension he never anticipated. What had begun as the natural death of an elderly woman had become a literal and metaphorical excavation of half a century's worth of buried secrets. He knew he needed more information, more context about who the Holloways really were before their complete isolation, and to do that, he would need to go beyond local records and delve into archives few had consulted in decades. Caldwell traveled to Charleston, the capital of West Virginia, where state records were kept in slightly better conditions than in rural counties. There, in the dusty basements of the state archive, he found documents that shed new and disturbing light on the Holloway family. Sarah Holloway, born Sarah Brennan in 1797, came from a well-known family in the eastern part of the state. Her father had been a relatively prosperous merchant, and Sarah had received an education above average for women at the time. She had married Thomas Holloway in 1816, when she was 19. Thomas was 10 years older, a farmer of modest origins who had inherited land in the Greenbrier Mountains. They had 4 daughters: Elizabeth, born in 1817, Margaret in 1820, Catherine in 1823, and a 4th daughter, Rebecca, born in 1826. Caldwell felt her heart race. 4 daughters. But only 3 had lived on the farm all those years. What had happened to Rebecca? Records showed that Rebecca Holloway was listed as alive until 1828, when she was just 2 years old. After that date, there was no further mention of her. No death records, no burial certificates, nothing. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. Caldwell felt a chill run down his spine. Could it be that the second, older grave didn't contain the sister's father, but rather the younger sister, who had disappeared from the records? He continued his search through the archives and found something even more disturbing. In 1829, a year after Rebecca's disappearance from the records, there was a brief and inconclusive investigation into allegations of abuse at Holloway Farm. A traveling doctor who had visited the property reported to authorities that he had seen signs of abuse on Thomas Holloway, Sarah's husband. The man had bruises on his face and arms, and when questioned, he offered vague explanations about accidents at the farm. The doctor had suspected something more sinister was afoot, but at the time, there was no legal framework to properly investigate domestic violence, especially when the alleged victim was an adult male. The case was dismissed without consequences. Thomas Holloway officially died in 1831, at the age of 41, presumably from a prolonged illness. His funeral, as Caldwell had already discovered, was a closed casket. The fragments began to form a terrifying picture. Sarah Holloway was no ordinary domestic tyrant. She was possibly a serial killer within her own family. Little Rebecca had disappeared when she was 2 years old. Thomas had shown signs of domestic violence before dying mysteriously 2 years later. And then, 4 years after Thomas's death, Sarah also disappeared, with a fractured skull that suggested a violent death. The pact the Holloway sisters made that October night in 1835 wasn't just a promise of silence. It was the construction of an invisible prison that would hold them captive for the rest of their lives. Caldwell, now fully immersed in reconstructing that family tragedy, began to understand the magnitude of the sacrifice Elizabeth, Margaret, and Catherine had made. They traded a quick death on the gallows for a slow death in isolation, watching the years pass while carrying a secret that corroded their souls day after day. The sheriff decided to seek more witnesses, people who might have interacted with the sisters over the decades and perhaps captured fragments of truth through their behavior or stray words. This is how he found Martha Yates, a 68-year-old woman who had worked briefly as an itinerant seamstress in the 1850s. Martha vividly remembered a visit she had made to Holloway Farm in 1854 to mend some of the sisters' clothing. Martha described the scene with details that still haunted her, almost 30 years later. The house was shadowy even during the day, with heavy curtains blocking out most of the sunlight. The three sisters moved through the house like synchronized shadows, always aware of each other's position, as if they were parts of a single fragmented organism. What had most disturbed Martha was the way they spoke. When one began a sentence, another often finished it, and the third nodded in silent agreement. It was as if they shared not just thoughts, but a single consciousness shaped by their shared secret. During that visit, Martha had needed to take measurements of Catherine, the youngest of the sisters. As she worked, she noticed something strange. Catherine had multiple old scars on her arms and shoulders, marks that looked like burns and cuts. When Martha innocently asked about the scars, the silence that descended on the house was absolute and terrifying. The three sisters exchanged that characteristic look Caldwell had heard mentioned many times, and then Elizabeth, the eldest, replied in a flat voice that they were childhood accidents, nothing more. But Martha had seen something in Catherine's eyes at that moment, a depth of pain that transcended simple explanations. They were the eyes of someone who had known prolonged suffering, the kind that leaves its mark not just on the skin, but on the very fabric of the soul. Martha had finished her work quickly and left, declining subsequent invitations to return to the estate. There was something there, she told Caldwell, that made every fiber of her being want to flee, a sense that those walls held horrors ordinary humans should not witness. Caldwell also located a former merchant named Samuel Hodges, who kept a general store in the village where the Holloway sisters occasionally purchased basic supplies. Hodges kept meticulous records of transactions spanning decades, and his ledgers revealed an interesting pattern. In the early years after Sarah's disappearance between 1835 and 1840, the sisters would come to the store every few weeks, always the three of them together, purchasing small quantities of flour, salt, and other essentials. But starting in 1840, their frequency declined dramatically. They appeared only once or twice a year, and they always looked deeply uncomfortable during these rare outings. Hodges specifically remembered one incident in 1846. The three sisters were at the grocery store when another customer casually mentioned that law enforcement was investigating a missing person case in a neighboring county. Hodges saw the three sisters go completely rigid, their faces draining of all color. They abandoned their purchases on the counter and hurriedly left, not returning for over a year. These details painted a portrait of women living in a constant state of terror. Every mention of the law, every talk of disappearances or crimes, every interaction with the outside world posed a potential risk of exposure. They had become so isolated that even a 2-mile trip to the village was an ordeal, requiring weeks of psychological preparation. The Pact of Silence wasn't just about not speaking, it was about not existing meaningfully outside the confines of their cursed estate. Caldwell delved back into Catherine's unsent letters, reading them with new understanding. A letter from 1861, written shortly before Elizabeth's death, revealed the tension that had begun to fracture their pact after more than 25 years. Catherine wrote about how Elizabeth had begun having nightmares in which Sarah returned from the dead to drag them all to hell. The three sisters had developed strange rituals to keep their secrets safe. They never mentioned the names of the dead aloud, referring to them only as the departed. They completely avoided the estate's backyard during the day, visiting the graves only at night under a new moon. Elizabeth, according to Catherine, had begun to question whether their silence had truly protected the family name or merely prolonged their agony. She suggested in moments of weakness that perhaps they should confess, face whatever punishment might come, and finally free their souls from the burden they carried. But Margaret and Catherine always persuaded her to keep their pact. Confession now, decades later, would be seen not as justice but as an admission of prolonged deceit. They would be punished not only for the original act, but for years of lying and concealment. Elizabeth's death in 1862, Caldwell now realized, may not have been as natural as recorded. She had died during the Civil War, a chaotic time when doctors were scarce and deaths were rarely properly investigated. Had Elizabeth finally decided to confess, and her sisters taken desperate measures to silence her permanently? Or had the weight of guilt literally consumed her will to live, and she simply wasted away to death? Catherine's later letters hinted at the first possibility in veiled terms. She wrote of how she and Margaret had done what was necessary to protect the Pact during Elizabeth's final days. She spoke of administering medicines to calm her older sister during her crises of conscience. In the euphemistic language of the time, this could mean anything from legitimate sedatives to deliberate poisoning. Caldwell suspected the latter. The pattern repeated itself with Margaret. She had outlived Elizabeth by 16 years, carrying the secret with only Catherine at her side. The two remaining sisters became even more reclusive, even more inseparable. And when Margaret began to weaken in 1878, Catherine wrote in one of her letters that, "I did for her what she would have done for me, ensuring that she departed without breaking our oath." Again, the language was ambiguous, but the implication was clear. Catherine may have hastened Margaret's death to ensure the secret remained intact. The revelation that the Holloway sisters had possibly resorted to further killing to preserve their original pact transformed Caldwell's investigation into something far more complex. He was no longer dealing with just one justifiable killing of an abusive mother in self-defense, but potentially a string of murders motivated by fear and desperation spanning decades. The line between victims and perpetrators had become impossible to clearly distinguish. The sheriff decided he needed to better understand the psychological dynamics that had kept the pact intact for nearly half a century. He sought the opinion of Dr. Henry Morrison, a physician who had trained in Philadelphia and had a particular interest in cases of mental illness and human behavior under extreme stress. Morrison traveled to Greenbrier specifically to review all the evidence Caldwell had compiled. After days of examining documents, letters, and the very places where the sisters had lived and died, Morrison offered an analysis that was both fascinating and terrifying. He explained that the three sisters had developed what he called shared guilt consciousness, a psychological phenomenon in which multiple people involved in a traumatic act become so emotionally intertwined that they essentially function as a single mental entity. The secret was carried not individually by each of them, but collectively by all three, creating an absolute psychological dependence between them. Morrison suggested that Elizabeth, Margaret, and Catherine probably never seriously considered the possibility of separate lives after 1835. Marriage would have meant bringing strangers into the circle, people who might eventually discover the secret. Leaving the estate would have meant breaking the unity that kept them psychologically stable. They became prisoners not only of the secret, but of each other, unable to function as independent individuals. Regarding the possible deaths of Elizabeth and Margaret at the hands of Catherine, or with her complicity, Morrison offered a disturbing perspective. He believed that, at that point in their lives, the sisters genuinely viewed preserving the secret as more important than their own individual lives. If Elizabeth or Margaret threatened to confess, it would not be seen by the others as a personal betrayal, but as the destruction of something sacred the three had built together through decades of sacrifice. In this distorted context, silencing a sister who threatened to speak would be perceived almost as an act of love, protecting her from breaking her oath and damning her own soul. Caldwell was deeply disturbed by this analysis, but it made sense of everything he had learned. The Holloway sisters were no ordinary monsters. They were women who had been forged into monsters by circumstance, first by Sarah's violence, then by the inability to confess what they had done without facing death, and finally by the accumulated weight of decades, living a lie that had become more real than any truth. The sheriff then turned his attention to an aspect that deeply intrigued him. Why had Catherine, the last survivor, kept all those unsent letters? If she truly was committed to absolute silence, why not destroy evidence that might eventually expose everything? Morrison suggested this revealed a deep inner conflict. Part of Catherine wanted the truth to be known, wanted someone to understand what they had endured, but another part couldn't bring herself to actively betray the pact that had defined her entire adult life. The letters were, in essence, confessions Catherine had written for her own sanity, knowing she would never send them, but needing to somehow express the burden she carried. She had kept them hidden during her lifetime, but left them where they would be found after her death. It was her way of confessing without breaking the pact, of revealing the truth without betraying her sisters. She had ensured the secret would die with her, but she had also ensured that eventually, when they were all beyond their earthly punishment, the truth would emerge. Caldwell decided to make one last visit to Holloway Farm before formally closing his investigation. It was late April 1883, and spring was beginning to green the mountains. He walked slowly through the decaying property, trying to imagine what it had been like to live there for nearly 50 years, always conscious of the 5 bodies buried in the backyard, always fearful that some visitor, some storm, some accident would expose the graves. The main house was now in advanced ruins. Part of the roof had completely collapsed during the winter, and wild animals were already beginning to take over the rooms. Caldwell cautiously entered and explored what remained. In the room that had apparently belonged to Catherine, he found something that had gone unnoticed in previous searches. Under a loose floorboard lay a small wooden chest. Inside the trunk were personal objects that told silent stories. There was a brooch that had likely belonged to Rebecca, the younger sister Sarah had murdered, a pocket watch that must have belonged to Thomas Holloway, a few locks of hair carefully tied with ribbons, each labeled with an embroidered name: Rebecca, Thomas, Sarah, Elizabeth, Margaret. Catherine had guarded these relics as a kind of secret altar, keeping the memory of the dead alive, even as she pretended some of them had never died there. Even more poignant was a tiny diary, no bigger than the palm of a hand, written in microscopic script. Caldwell brought it to the window where the light was better and began to read. The entries spanned years, small fragments of thoughts that Catherine had apparently recorded when the weight of silence became unbearable. One entry from 1842 simply read, "7 years. I feel as if I've already lived a lifetime in just 7 years. How many more until we can rest?" Another entry from 1858 was more elaborate. "Elizabeth dreams more and more about that night. She told me today that sometimes she can't remember if it really happened or if it was just a terrible nightmare the 3 of us shared. Margaret said it's better this way, that when we can no longer distinguish between memory and dream, it's a sign that the past is finally losing its power over us. But I know the truth. The past never loses its power. It just buries itself deeper, where it hurts in ways we can't name." One of the last entries, made in 1882, just months before Catherine's death, was particularly revealing. "I am old now. My body fails. Soon I will be with my sisters, and then there will be 4 of us again, waiting in the back garden until the world completely forgets we ever existed. I will leave clues for anyone who wants to find them. I cannot break the pact, but I can leave doors open. Let them judge us as they will when we are all beyond judgment." Caldwell closed the small diary with trembling hands. Catherine's words echoed in his mind, like voices from a past that refused to remain buried. He realized then that his investigation was not just about uncovering what had happened, but about honoring Catherine's final wish that the truth be known, even decades after everyone involved was gone. She had laid a trail of crumbs so that someone would eventually piece together the full story. Back in his Greenbrier office, Caldwell spent weeks organizing all the documentation he had collected. He knew he had to make difficult decisions about how to present his findings to state authorities and the public. Technically, there was evidence of multiple homicides, but all the perpetrators were dead. There was no justice to be served in the traditional sense, only truths to be recorded for posterity. The sheriff consulted the county prosecutor, a pragmatic man named William Crawford. After reviewing all the evidence, Crawford reached a conclusion that, while legally questionable, was humanly understandable. He argued that prosecuting the dead served no purpose other than to needlessly tarnish the names of women who had already suffered sufficient punishment through decades of self-inflicted torment. The real criminal, Sarah Holloway, had already received her justice at the hands of her victims. Regarding the possible deaths of Elizabeth and Margaret, Crawford noted that there was no definitive evidence of homicide, only hints in letters that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Both were elderly women when they died, and their deaths could easily have been natural. Even if Catherine had hastened their ends, it was likely through acts of twisted mercy, not pure malice. Prosecuting this posthumously would be an exercise in pointless cruelty. The final decision was to officially register the discoveries, but seal them in archives that would only be made available to the public 50 years later. This would preserve the story for future historians and researchers, but would spare the few distant relatives the Holloways still had in the area from immediate public humiliation. The 5 bodies were exhumed and given proper burials in the local cemetery, each with a simple headstone listing only the name and date, with no further details. But Caldwell couldn't simply close the case and move on. The Holloway sisters had become an obsession, a constant reminder of the complexity of human nature and the impossible choices that extreme circumstances can force upon ordinary people. He began writing a detailed account of the case, not as an official document, but as a personal narrative, attempting to understand what justice truly meant in situations where victims and perpetrators were impossible to clearly separate. In her writings, Caldwell reflected on how society at the time had failed the Holloway sisters on multiple levels. First, it failed to protect Rebecca, the girl who died at Sarah's hands when adequate protection systems could have saved her. Then, it failed to recognize the signs of domestic violence against Thomas Holloway, dismissing them due to gender biases that prevented the conception of a woman as an aggressor. And finally, it failed to create a legal system where the three sisters could have sought justice against Sarah without fearing their own deaths by hanging. The sheriff also contemplated the nature of the pact the sisters had made. It was hard not to admire, disturbingly, the strength of will required to keep such a devastating secret for so many decades. Most people would have broken under much less pressure, but the Holloway sisters had fused into a single entity of silence, sacrificing any possibility of individual happiness to protect something they considered greater than themselves: the family name, dignity in death, and perhaps, in a twisted way, each other's memory. Caldwell interviewed Dr. Morrison again, seeking to better understand the psychology behind such dedication to such a destructive pact. Morrison explained that humans have an extraordinary capacity to rationalize and even sanctify suffering when they believe it serves a higher purpose. The sisters had transformed their pact of silence into something almost religious, a sacred oath that gave meaning to their empty lives. Without this pact, they would have to confront the possibility that their 50 years of isolation had been an absolute waste. The doctor also noted that the sisters' extreme isolation had likely intensified their interdependence in ways that people living in a normal community would never experience. They had no other relationships, no other identities beyond the Holloway sisters who keep the secret. Each had become a mirror of the others, constantly reflecting and reinforcing their shared commitment. It was a kind of collective madness, but a functional madness that had kept them alive and relatively stable for decades. In June of 1883, Caldwell made one last visit to Holloway Farm before the property was sold at public auction to pay off accumulated debts. He walked to where the 5 graves had stood, now just shallow depressions in the earth after the exhumations. Spring had brought wildflowers that grew abundantly in the soil, perhaps nourished by the remains of the lives that had been buried there. He thought of Sarah Holloway, the matriarch who had unleashed this tragedy through her violence and control. He thought of Rebecca, the girl who had never had a chance to grow up. He thought of Thomas, the husband who had likely suffered in silence before his mysterious death. And most of all, he thought of Elizabeth, Margaret, and Catherine, 3 women who had chosen a form of living death to avoid physical death, and in the process had become as much prisoners of their choice as they had ever been of Sarah. The sun was beginning to set over the Appalachian mountains, painting the sky with fiery reds and oranges. Caldwell stood there for a long time, paying silent respects not only to the dead, but to the impossible complexity of human experience that this place represented. There were no happy endings here, no clear redemption, only layers of tragedy built upon tragedy over half a century. The following months brought changes to the Greenbrier area that seemed to deliberately erase the last vestiges of the Holloway family's history. The farm was purchased by a family from out of state, German immigrants who knew nothing of the property's dark past. They demolished the old house, built a new structure, and transformed the abandoned fields into productive crops. It was as if the land was eager to forget the blood it had absorbed over the decades, but Caldwell knew that some secrets are too heavy to be buried completely. He kept receiving letters from people who had known the Holloway sisters over the years, each sharing small memories that, in isolation, seemed insignificant, but together formed a mosaic of loneliness and suffering that spanned generations. One woman wrote of seeing Margaret weeping silently in the village in 1868, tears streaming down her face as she stood still, as if she had forgotten that tears were visible to others. Another correspondent, a man who had briefly worked as a blacksmith in the region in the 1870s, recalled a strange encounter with Catherine. She had come to his shop to repair a farm tool, and while waiting, she had begun to speak almost deliriously about how iron could be shaped through fire, how broken things could be reforged, but some fractures were permanent, invisible to the eye but always present in the structure of the metal. He hadn't understood at the time, but now, knowing the full story, those words took on a disturbing meaning. Caldwell also discovered that the sisters hadn't been completely forgotten by the wider community. Local legends were beginning to form, whispered stories of 3 ghosts who walked the mountains on moonless nights, searching for something they had lost long ago. Some hunters swore they heard female voices singing ancient songs in perfect harmony, coming from deep within the forests, often in places where no dwelling existed for miles. The sheriff was skeptical of ghost stories, but he understood their psychological purpose. People needed ways to process tragedies that defied rational comprehension. Transforming the Holloway sisters into wandering spirits was a way to keep their stories alive while distancing them enough to be non-threatening. It was more comfortable to believe in ghosts in the mountains than to confront the reality that real women had lived and died in such desperate circumstances. In 1884, a year after Catherine's death, Caldwell received an unexpected visitor. An elderly man who identified himself as a distant cousin of the Holloways had traveled from Pennsylvania after hearing rumors of discoveries at the family's former estate. He wasn't seeking money or an inheritance, but simply understanding. His mother, he explained, had been Sarah Holloway's cousin and had occasionally mentioned the family with a tone of concern mingled with fear. The man, whose name was Edmund Brennan, shared family stories that shed additional light on Sarah. According to Edmund, Sarah had been known even before her marriage as a volatile person. She had a younger sister who died under mysterious circumstances when they were both teenagers, a death that was never adequately explained, but which sparked whispers within the family. Edmund's mother had always suspected Sarah of involvement, but at the time there was no evidence and people preferred not to make such serious accusations. Edmund revealed something more disturbing. Sarah had apparently suffered severe abuse from her own father as a child. This didn't justify her later actions, but it offered context for how cycles of violence can perpetuate themselves across generations. Sarah had been a victim who became a perpetrator, and her daughters, in turn, had been forced to become something they never wanted to be. It was a cascade of trauma cascading down through time, each generation scarring the next in irreparable ways. Caldwell shared with Edmund what he had discovered, respecting the decision to keep certain details sealed in official records, but offering enough of an overview for the man to grasp the magnitude of the family tragedy. Edmund listened in silence, occasional tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. When Caldwell finished, Edmund remained silent for a long time before speaking. "My mother used to say that some families carry curses that aren't supernatural, but simply patterns of behavior, passed from one person to another like contagious diseases," Edmund finally said. The Holloways were one such family. Sarah carried the violence she suffered and multiplied it in the lives of her daughters, and they, poor souls, tried to break it the only way they knew how, but in the process became prisoners of another kind of curse. Silence. That conversation stayed with Caldwell for a long time. He began to see the case not as a series of individual crimes, but as a Shakespearean tragedy where circumstances, choices, and systemic failures converged to create suffering that perpetuated itself almost automatically. There were no simple villains here except perhaps Sarah, and even she had been shaped by forces beyond her complete control. The sheriff decided to expand his writings on the case, creating not only a factual record, but also an analysis of what the Holloway's story revealed about society at the time. He wrote about how the lack of resources for victims of domestic violence created situations where desperate people took desperate measures, about how the geographic isolation of the Appalachian Mountains allowed family tragedies to unfold completely out of the sight of the law, about how rigid concepts of family honor and reputation could imprison people as effectively as physical chains. Their writings also explored complex moral questions raised by the case. Were the Holloway sisters guilty or innocent, victims or perpetrators? The answer, Caldwell concluded, was that they were both simultaneously, and any attempt to classify them into simple categories would fail to capture the reality of their experience. They had made choices, yes, but choices made under extreme duress and justified fear. They had maintained silence, but a silence that seemed the only option available to them in a system that would brutally punish them for seeking justice through official channels. In his final reflections on the case, Caldwell wrote something that summed up his mature understanding of the situation. The story of the Holloway sisters is not about good versus evil, but about how human beings respond when placed in impossible situations where every available choice carries a terrible cost. They chose to live with secret guilt rather than die with public shame. They chose decades of solitary isolation rather than minutes of humiliation on the gallows. I cannot say whether they made the right choice, only that they made the human choice, and they paid for it every day of their long lives. As 1884 progressed, Caldwell realized that his investigation of the Holloway case had transformed not only his understanding of that particular family, but also his view of the nature of justice and historical truth. He began to question how many other isolated properties in the Appalachian Mountains held similar secrets, how many families lived under the weight of silences that corroded their souls for generation after generation. The mountains were vast, the valleys deep and isolated, and the law rarely penetrated beyond the main villages. The sheriff decided to expand his investigation, not specifically looking for crimes, but for patterns of extreme isolation and peculiar family behaviors that might indicate buried secrets. He traveled to neighboring counties, spoke with other law enforcement officials, and slowly began to map what he called the geography of silence in Appalachia. There were more cases than he had initially imagined, though none as well documented as the Holloways. A particularly disturbing discovery came from Monroe County, adjacent to Greenbrier. There, a family named Prescott lived in a similar isolation to the Holloways. Two elderly sisters, never married, had lived alone on a remote property for decades. When Caldwell visited them under the guise of a census, he found an eerily familiar dynamic: heavy silence, exchanged glances laden with unspoken meaning, a refusal to discuss the past. He had neither jurisdiction nor evidence to investigate, but the similarity to the Holloways was impossible to ignore. These findings led Caldwell to a grim conclusion. The Holloway sisters were not a unique aberration, but an extreme example of a broader pattern. In a society where women had few legal rights, where domestic violence was considered a private matter, and where geographic isolation made outside intervention nearly impossible, similar tragedies likely occurred with disturbing frequency. Most would simply never be discovered, their secrets dying with the last witnesses and rotting in the earth along with the bodies. The sheriff also began receiving correspondence from people in other states who had heard about the Holloway case through regional newspapers that published sanitized versions of the story. One Kentucky woman wrote about her own grandmother, who had lived with two sisters in complete isolation for 40 years, refusing until the end to explain why they never married or left the family estate. Another North Carolina correspondent reported a similar story involving three siblings who lived together in complete seclusion, keeping a secret they took to their graves. These accounts convinced Caldwell that he was documenting not just an individual crime, but a broader social phenomenon. He began work on an expanded manuscript that used the Holloway case as its central study, but contextualized it within a larger pattern of family secrets and isolation in the mountainous regions of the eastern United States. His goal was not only to preserve the story of the Holloway sisters, but to use that story to illuminate the social conditions that allowed such tragedies to occur. During this process of writing and expanded research, Caldwell made an additional discovery that added a final layer of complexity to the Holloway case. He found records of a brief, abandoned investigation from 1837, just 2 years after Sarah's disappearance. A different sheriff, now deceased for decades, had received an anonymous tip suggesting something suspicious had occurred at the Holloway farm. The sheriff had visited the property, spoken with the three sisters, and noted in his notes that something seemed amiss, but without concrete evidence, he could not act. Most disturbing was that old sheriff's final note. The three young women seemed terrified, but not of me. Of something else, something I can't quite put my finger on. When I asked about their mother, all three turned pale as ghosts. The youngest, Catherine, began to shake visibly. Something happened in that house, I'm sure of it. But with no body, no witnesses willing to speak, my hands are tied. They've made their choice to remain silent. I can only hope they can live with it. That sheriff knew, or at least strongly suspected. But the legal limitations of the time, combined with a lack of physical evidence and the sisters' refusal to cooperate, made any action impossible. Caldwell imagined how different the sisters' lives might have been if that sheriff had pressed harder, if he'd had the resources to investigate properly, if the legal system offered some protection to women in domestic violence situations that led them to desperate acts. But these were all hypotheses about a world that never existed. Caldwell's manuscript grew to hundreds of pages, blending factual narrative with social analysis, philosophical reflections on justice and morality, and even careful speculation about the sisters' psychological state throughout their decades of isolation. He knew the work was unconventional for a law enforcement officer, closer to literature or sociology than a traditional police report. But he felt the case demanded this expanded treatment, that reducing it to a simple list of facts would betray the complexity of the lives it documented. In October of 1885, exactly 50 years after Sarah Holloway's original disappearance, Caldwell hosted a small private ceremony at the cemetery, where the 5 family members now rested in appropriately marked graves. He invited Edmund Brennan, Dr. Morrison, and a few people who had known the sisters during their lives. It wasn't a funeral per se, but a belated recognition of lives lived under extraordinary circumstances. Caldwell read a passage he had written specifically for the occasion. "We gather not to judge, for judgment has already been executed through 50 years of self-imposed imprisonment. Not to forgive, for it is not our place to grant forgiveness for acts committed in despair that we ourselves never experienced. We gather simply to remember that here lie 5 human souls whose lives were entwined in tragedy that none of them chose, but all were forced to navigate as best they could. May they now rest free from the secrets that bound them in life." After the ceremony, as the few mourners dispersed, Caldwell stood alone among the graves. Autumn painted the mountains vibrant reds and golds, the same season when it all began 5 decades earlier. He thought of his sisters, imagining them as young women in that distant October of 1835, facing an impossible choice that would define the rest of their lives. He thought of how many times over the years they must have wished they had chosen differently, and how many times they must have convinced themselves there was no other option. The wind blew through the trees, carrying fallen leaves in spirals that seemed to dance among the tombstones. For a fleeting moment, Caldwell allowed himself to imagine they were the 3 sisters, finally free, finally able to move without the weight of their shared secret. It was a fantastical thought, unscientific, but deeply human. He smiled sadly to himself and turned to leave, leaving the dead to their well-deserved rest. The following years brought profound changes to the Appalachian region and to Caldwell itself. The arrival of 1890 marked the beginning of a new era of industrialization in the mountains, with railroads cutting through previously inaccessible valleys and logging companies establishing operations in forests that had lain untouched for centuries. The isolation that had allowed secrets like the Holloways to remain buried was being systematically destroyed by the march of progress. Caldwell, now 53, had become a respected figure not only as a sheriff, but also as something approaching a local historian and social philosopher. His manuscript on the Holloway case circulated privately among academics and social reformers interested in issues of domestic violence and rural justice. Although never commercially published, due to the sensitive nature of the material, the work influenced conversations about the need for improvements in the legal system, particularly regarding protections for victims of abuse. It was during this period that Caldwell received an unexpected letter that would reopen aspects of the case he had considered closed. The letter came from a woman named Helena Pritchard, a resident of Richmond, Virginia, who identified herself as the daughter of a distant cousin of the Holloway sisters. Helena wrote that her deceased mother had maintained a secret correspondence with Catherine Holloway during the 1860s, a correspondence that Helena had only recently discovered while sorting through her mother's belongings after her death. The letters Helena possessed were different from the ones Caldwell had found with Catherine. These had actually been sent and received, creating a dialogue over the years between 2 women who knew each other only vaguely but shared blood ties. Helena's mother, whose name was Ruth, had apparently offered Catherine something rare in her isolated life, a non-judgmental listener, someone distant enough to be safe but connected enough to care. Caldwell traveled to Richmond to examine the letters himself. What he read in the yellowed pages added profound emotional dimensions to the story he thought he knew completely. Catherine wrote to Ruth not about the specific events of 1835, never directly confessing what had happened, but about the emotional toll of living under the weight of secrets. Her words revealed a woman of remarkable intelligence and sensitivity, someone who, under different circumstances, might have lived a rich and fulfilling life. A letter from 1864 was particularly revealing. Catherine wrote of recurring dreams in which she was walking through the mountains free and alone, discovering valleys and peaks she had never seen before. But always in the dreams, she eventually heard her sister's voices calling her back and felt herself pulled as if by invisible strings back to the farm. She wrote, "I wake from these night visions with a sense of loss so deep I can hardly breathe. It is not a physical prison that binds me here, dear cousin, but chains forged of promises and shared guilt. Even if the doors were open, I would not know how to pass through them." Another letter from 1871, 3 years before Margaret's death, touched on an even more disturbing theme. Catherine mentioned that she and her sisters had discussed what they would do when the last of them stood alone. They had agreed that the last one should leave some record, some form of truth that would emerge after they were all dead. Catherine wrote, "Margaret insists that we carry our secret intact to the grave, but Elizabeth and I feel there is something cowardly in dying without allowing the world to know our story. We seek no posthumous judgment or absolution, only recognition that we existed, that we suffered, that we made impossible choices in impossible circumstances." Ruth, in her responses, offered words of compassion without ever pressing Catherine to reveal specifically what was weighing on her. Ruth wrote about her own difficult marriage, about how women of her time often lived lives of desperate silence, trapped by social expectations and a lack of alternatives. She validated Catherine's feelings without needing to know the details, offering the kind of emotional support the Holloway sisters likely never received from anyone other than each other. The correspondence ended abruptly in 1868. Catherine's last letter mentioned that Ruth should no longer write, that maintaining contact was becoming dangerous in ways she could not explain. Caldwell speculated that Margaret, perhaps sensing that Catherine was developing an emotional attachment to the outside world, had insisted that the correspondence cease. The isolation needed to be absolute for the pact to remain intact. Helena Pritchard also shared with Caldwell memories her mother had shared with her in the last years of her life. Ruth had told her daughter that she had always suspected something terrible had happened at Holloway Farm, but had never been able to pinpoint exactly what. She had felt through Catherine's letters the weight of deep trauma, the kind of suffering that scars the soul permanently. Ruth had subtly tried to offer Catherine a way out, suggesting she come visit her in Richmond, but Catherine had always politely declined, explaining that she could not leave her sisters. This revelation made Caldwell reconsider his understanding of the sisters' pact. He had thought of it primarily as a prison, but these letters suggested there was also an element of genuine loyalty between the three. They held together not just out of fear of exposure, but out of twisted love and a sense of mutual responsibility. They had been through hell together, and this had created a bond that transcended reason or individual self-preservation. To separate would be like amputating parts of themselves. Caldwell integrated these new discoveries into his manuscript, adding an entire chapter dedicated to the correspondence between Catherine and Ruth. He reflected on how these letters represented a window into the Holloway sisters' humanity that other documents failed to capture. Official records and even Catherine's unsent letters showed women defined by their crime and secrecy. But the correspondence with Ruth showed Catherine as a whole person, with dreams, regrets, and a capacity for deep emotional connection. The sheriff also began to consider the case's broader legacy. The Holloway sisters' story was beginning to circulate in reform circles as an example of why social change was needed. Women's rights activists cited the case when arguing for laws that protected victims of domestic violence and offered legal alternatives to private revenge. Prison reformers used the story to question whether incarceration or execution were appropriate responses to crimes committed under extreme duress. In 1892, Caldwell was invited to present his findings at a conference on rural justice at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. It was a surreal experience for a rural county sheriff to speak before an audience of professors, lawyers, and social activists. But his presentation focused not on sensational details but on the broader moral and social issues the case raised, was met with respectful attention and vigorous discussion. During a question-and-answer session after his presentation, a young lawyer raised a question Caldwell had been avoiding directly addressing. If the Holloway sisters were still alive, would he arrest them? Caldwell remained silent for a long moment before answering with an honesty that haunted him. "I don't know. As a law enforcement officer, I should say yes without hesitation, but as a man who has spent years studying their lives, who has read their words, who has walked the property where they lived, prisoners of their own choosing for 50 years, I cannot say with certainty that justice would be served by arresting them. They have already served a sentence harsher than any court could impose. The beginning of the new century brought a sense of closure and reflection for Caldwell. He had retired as sheriff in 1897 after 23 years of service, but the Holloway case remained a central part of his life. Now 62, he devoted his days to finishing the manuscript that had become his life's work, a document of over 400 pages that blended criminal investigation, social analysis, and philosophical meditation on the nature of justice and redemption. In 1902, exactly 20 years after discovering the graves at Holloway Farm, Caldwell made a final pilgrimage to the cemetery where the 5 victims of that family tragedy lay. The place had changed considerably. The cemetery had been expanded and improved, with stone paths and benches for visitors. The Holloway headstones, once simple and unadorned, had been replaced with more elaborate markers, funded by Edmund Brennan before his own death a few years earlier. The new headstones were identical in design, a deliberate decision by Brennan to symbolize that, in death, all family members had finally achieved the equality and peace they had been denied in life. Each bore their name, birth and death dates, and a single shared line that Brennan had carefully chosen. Freed now from all earthly burdens, Caldwell touched each headstone in sequence, starting with Rebecca, the youngest victim, and ending with Catherine, the last keeper of the secret. As he stood there, Caldwell reflected on everything he had learned during 2 decades of studying that family. The Holloway story offered no simple lessons or clear morality. There were no unequivocal heroes or outright villains, just flawed human beings navigating situations that tested the limits of moral endurance. Sarah had been both a victim of her own traumatic childhood and a perpetrator of violence against her family. The 3 sisters had been both killers and survivors, fighting for freedom from the tyranny that imprisoned them. What impressed Caldwell most was the human capacity to endure prolonged suffering. 50 years, half a century of living with a secret that weighed on every breath, every thought, every interaction with the outside world. Most people would break under such pressure within weeks or months. But Elizabeth, Margaret, and Catherine had found strength in each other, transforming their pact of silence into a framework that had sustained them through decades of isolation. It was a disturbing testament to human resilience, but also to how that same resilience could imprison as much as it liberate. Caldwell also reflected on the changes she had witnessed during her lifetime. The world of 1902 was radically different from that of 1835. Women were beginning to gain legal rights that simply hadn't existed when the Holloway sisters were young. Domestic violence laws, while still inadequate, at least existed in many states. Foster care systems were beginning to emerge, offering alternatives where before there had been only despair. Had the sisters been born 50 years later, their lives might have been completely different. But Caldwell also recognized that progress was slow and uneven. In the remote Appalachian Mountains, in isolated valleys across rural America, families still lived under conditions similar to those that had shaped the Holloway tragedy. Women and men were still trapped in domestic violence without recourse or real alternatives. Secrets were still buried on isolated properties, far from the eyes of the law and society. The Holloway story was not a relic of the distant past, but a mirror reflecting realities that continued to exist. The manuscript Caldwell finally completed in 1933 wasn't just about the Holloways. It was about all of us, about how societies create conditions that push people into impossible choices and then judge them for making those choices. It was about how isolation, whether geographic or social, allows tragedies to unfold without witnesses. It was about how secrets, even those kept for understandable reasons, consume those who carry them from the inside out. Caldwell knew his work would never be commercially published during his lifetime. The material was too sensitive, the questions it raised too uncomfortable. But he arranged for the manuscript to be deposited in the archives of the West Virginia Historical Society, with instructions that it be made available to serious researchers interested in the social history of the region. He hoped that eventually, when enough time had passed, someone would discover the work and breathe new life into it. In its final pages, Caldwell wrote a reflection that summed up everything he had felt about the case. The story of the Holloway sisters teaches us that justice is a more complex concept than our laws recognize. It teaches us that victims can become perpetrators without ceasing to be victims, that choices made in moments of extreme terror cannot be judged by those who have never faced such moments. And above all, it teaches us that the cost of silence, even when it seems necessary, is always higher than we imagine when we choose to remain silent. Caldwell died in 1908 at the age of 71. Among his belongings were photographs he had taken of the old Holloway farm before its demolition, meticulous records of each stage of his investigation, and copies of all letters and documents related to the case. Everything was carefully preserved and added to the archive he had started. His last will and testament specified that he wished to be buried not far from the 5 Holloway headstones, perhaps feeling that he had spent so much time with those troubled souls that he deserved to rest near them. Years passed, and the Holloway sisters' story gradually faded from popular memory. The farmhouse where they lived was sold and resold countless times, each new family unaware of the place's dark past. The Appalachian mountains continued to hold their secrets, as they always had. But in dusty archives, in the pages of Caldwell's manuscript, the story remained preserved, waiting to be rediscovered. And here we are, more than a century later, unearthing these buried truths, confronting the same questions about justice, morality, and human nature that haunted Caldwell. The Holloway sisters' story resonates through time, not because it is unique, but because it illuminates universal truths about how people respond to trauma, how families keep secrets, and how societies fail the most vulnerable. The 3 sisters made a pact that distant October night in 1835, promising to carry their mother's name to the grave intact, and technically, they kept that promise. They died without confessing, protecting the Holloway family reputation to the end, as they believed it should be protected. But what they didn't foresee was that the truth, like water seeking cracks in rock, eventually finds its way to the surface. Buried secrets don't stay buried forever. Someone always digs them up, someone always discovers them, and the story finally emerges into the light. If you've made it this far on this journey through half a century of silence and secrets, through the dark mountains of Appalachia and the even darker corridors of human experience, know that stories like this deserve to be remembered. Not to sensationalize tragedy, but to honor lives lived under extraordinary circumstances. If this account touched you in any way, if it made you think about the nature of justice or the complexity of human morality, consider subscribing to this channel. Leave a like so others can also discover these disturbing yet essential stories from the past. And in the comments, share your thoughts. Were the Holloway sisters victims or guilty? Was justice served through their self-imposed suffering, or was it denied by a system that forced them into silence? There are no easy answers, only conversations we must continue having, until the next story that forces us to confront the darkest corners of American history.